is Terry Bradshaw, quarterback, Pittsburgh Steelers.
Touched by Downing, swinging. There's a drive into left center field. That ball has got to be out of here. It's gone. It's 7:15. There's a new home run champion of all time. And it's
ABC's Monday Night Baseball, live from Fenway Park in Boston, Massachusetts.
He is fading, looking. He's under the gun. He's tied, he throws. It is.
This is baseball, Major League Baseball. And this is Mel Allen.
Welcome to the Past Our Prime podcast, the January 21st edition, as we go back 50 years and look at the January 21st, 1974 cover of Sports Illustrated with Larry Zonka on the cover. Joining me, as always, Mark Hoffman and Bill Mahoney. And, this guy was an iconic football player back in the day. Everybody knew who the Zonk was, and they have the perfect season in 72, and they back it up here in 73. The Dolphins, maybe not the team of the decade, because the Steelers would then come along, but certainly one of the greatest teams, and for one season in particular, the greatest team in NFL history.
Yeah, the Dolphins team was incredible. I mean, it was after they had the perfect season. Obviously, they didn't have a perfect season the following year, but when they got to the Super Bowl and they met the Minnesota Vikings that year, the score wasn't so lopsided, sounding 24-7, but the game was total domination by the Dolphins from the opening kickoff. And the other thing I remember so much about that game, they played it at the University of Rice Stadium, I want to think. It wasn't even at a major stadium.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a Super Bowl today being played like at a small college stadium,
right,
not an elite stadium? And also it was played like during the day. It wasn't this primetime event. But that game, that was total domination, and kind of sort of ended the Dolphins' run.
Yeah.
But also, you look back at that, and you look at that game, and nowadays, everything's based on the passing game. In that game alone, Bob Greasy threw 7 passes the whole game. The lowest Super Bowl ever. That would never happen this day and age. They'd be like, wait a minute. But you look at Csonka for 145 yards and 2 TDs, MVP. Just an amazing player for a guy that at one point in time in his life couldn't get put on the offense. The coaches wouldn't let him run the ball.
And joining us now from the cover of the January 21st, 1974 issue of Sports Illustrated, the MVP of that Super Bowl win for the Miami Dolphins, Hall of Famer. When you start talking to these guys that are Hall of Famers and stuff, I could just read your resume, Larry, and a half hour later say, hey, thanks for joining us. So I'm not going to go through too much of it, but Larry, thank you for joining us and to talk specifically about that time in your life, the running the ball for Don Shula and the Dolphins.
Well, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
Let's talk about that game in particular. You get the ball, opening drive ends in a touchdown for the Dolphins. Vikes go 3 and out. You get the ball, another touchdown. I think this one from your buddy Jim Kick, 14-0, and here we are pretty soon, back-to-back Super Bowl champs. What do you remember from that game?
I remember the anticipation leading up to that game was very great because we had played, I don't know if it was Minnesota that necessarily earlier that year or the year before. Might have been early in the year before when we went to the 72 Super Bowl from the 72 season. But I'd had a particularly bad experience at the hand of the Vikings. A guy named Roy Winston was a backup linebacker for them. And on a 3rd and long situation, he came the closest of putting me out of football that I ever came. Tremendous hit put on me. And I marked that. I remembered that. And all through that Super Bowl, I was keeping a constant look. If you've ever seen the hit, the recording of the hit, you'll know why I had my head on a spindle looking for Roy Winston all the time, that entire game, the second time we met up with him.
So you put that behind you, obviously, because 33 carries, 145 yards. Bob Greasy, as we were talking earlier, you guys only throw the ball 7 times. I mean, they throw the ball 7 times in the first quarter of a preseason game now. So obviously, you guys thought you could control the game the way you did so much of that time in your career by just pounding the ball and giving you the ball.
We didn't think that. We knew that. We had proven that through from 1970 all the way through the 3 Super Bowls. That ball control was necessarily that was the formula to win particularly back then in the 70s, was ball control offense and then having a great defense, to counterbalance that and get the ball back. Then control the ball, run the clock out. That was our formula. It didn't change through that entire stint of the 70s with Shula. I think now the rules have changed a great deal. The game is much faster. Some say better. I suppose it's more exciting. I don't know. But when you compare teams from now till then, you have to take into consideration the rules changes because there's been quite a few.
Certainly. One of my favorite parts of football is when, you line up and basically you don't even have to call a play. They know what you're going to do. You know what you're going to do. Can they stop you? And the answer for much of that time in Miami was no. They couldn't stop you guys. Your offensive line, your offense as a whole, just too many weapons.
Well, that came down to not necessarily stopping us. I agree with you that, that was the intent, to stop us. But what we did was we executed that running game with such perfection and such direction that in order for any defense to able to hold us less than 4 yards a carry, was they had to jam people up in there. Well, the minute they jammed people up in there to stop that, by our set, offensively, when we came up to the ball and presented that set that meant that we were going to run that power play, that defense would cheat into that. Well, the minute they cheat into that, that shortens the coverage on your wideouts. It shortens the backup coverage to your other running back. So, you can't put all your people in there to stop that on a consistent basis and not pay the price for a play action pass. A fake dive and then a pull off to the tight end or off to the halfback. And because of that, we would do it 2 or 3 times, and about the 4th or 5th time that the defense lined up that same way trying to stop it, Bob Greasy would pull the ball back out and throw it to Marv Fleming or Jim Mandich or Jim Kick. And that made the difference. So, with today's rules the way they are, I don't think you can see that kind of ball control. It's called ball control, but it's actually clock control because you burn up time while you're doing that because there's no timeout. The ball hasn't been thrown. There's no reset the ball or anything. The clock keeps running. So it was a tremendous asset.
Larry, Mark Hoffman here. Back then in the 70s, a lot of times the quarterbacks would call their plays. Was it true that in the huddle that Greasy would say to you, hey, Larry, what play do you want to call? What do you want to run?
Oh, absolutely. Not only you didn't have anybody in your ear, we didn't have cell phones, any of that connection. All that's been much later. The rules changes, the constant communication with your offensive coordinator. They have computers on the sidelines they're looking at. My goodness, it's far different from back then. We had to count on Bob Greasy, Earl Morrall's brain to remember what was going on. Now, certainly we had people coming in from the sidelines bringing the play that the offensive coordinator or the head coach had determined that he wanted. But you couldn't talk back and forth for 15 to 18 seconds with your offensive coordinator who had a computer at his control and looking at what the defense was doing. Think about that. Think about how intricate that's become and how time restricted that is and how much information is changing with 2 or 3 minds at that point. Back then we had Bob Greasy and Earl Morrall and their ability to remember all the things that we had practiced, remembering, 3rd and 2, what's our best deal for their defense. And that's what we counted on.
Now, Larry, Bill Mahoney here. I know you talk about, clock control. 33 carries is 33 carries. That means you're going. How beat up were you after that Super Bowl, after all those carries?
Well, 33 carries for 33 yards would indicate that it was pretty beat up, wouldn't it? But 33 carries for perhaps 100 or 125 yards meant that inner working, the parts that you can't see that used to be there, the fans had little appreciation for because it's tough to see from the stands. Unless you're a very experienced football player, you can set up in the stands and see the execution of the offensive line because it's so crowded in there and the movement's so fast. But when you can see how intricate that was, you become much more appreciative of the running game. Of course, when you sit in the stands today, the rules have all changed for the passing game to enhance the passing game, because when you sit in the stands as a fan, you see a guy throw it, you see a guy catch it. What's not to understand? You understand the whole complexity of the passing game, or much of it, because you're seeing it stretched out on the field in front of you. But when it's a fast hitting play running game, it's hard to appreciate what ball control, the words ball control represent, and how dependent, getting back to what you were talking about, how dependent we were on the quarterback's brain, because we had no electronic hookup with the sideline.
Larry, the 72 team gets all the hype, but was the 73 team just as good?
No, they were 2 games worse.
What are you, an idiot?
Yeah, what are you thinking, man?
Yes.
Well, it comes down to that. And the reason that we're the number one team of the first 100 years is we were the only one to do it. And the number one team in the sense of obtaining perfection. Were we the most colorful? Did we throw the ball the most? Did we do this or did we do that the most? I don't know. But in that one category, we're the best team of all time because we're the only team of all time to do that. You can't argue with that. That's gracious. But if you want to say, well, what team's the greatest team because they won the most Super Bowls? Well, certainly, it becomes obvious. What player won the most or got the most MVPs? Certainly. You can't argue with those, but neither can you argue with perfection. It's the only time it was attained in 102 or 103 years, whatever it is now. If that's correct, and as far as all the record keeping goes, it's as correct as we know it. Doesn't matter whether you're playing 8 games or 14 games or 16 games or 44 games. Perfection is perfection. And it's just that tough. There's a reason only one team got it, and they paid the price, and were intelligent enough to be able to be aware enough to pay the price.
Larry, I just finished your book, Head On, a memoir. Really, really enjoyed it. Can't recommend it enough. Well,
thank you. Thank you. That's very kind of you. I put a lot of the human side, kind of the individual side.
You sure did.
Person-to-person stuff that happened in that book.
I mean, it's a football book, but it is a lot more. But I wanted to talk to you about, you guys have won. You had the perfect season. You win your first game in 73. You go to Oakland, and you find something in the locker room there that could have helped you win and keep that streak going. Can you tell us that story?
Art Toms was a defensive tackle that played with me at Syracuse through my tenure at Syracuse. I think he's a year behind me in class. And he was playing for the Raiders. And when we went out to get ready for the game, the Miami Dolphins, we went out and used their, practiced in their stadium. Because there was some mechanical problems in our locker room at the stadium, they closed it the day before. They were doing something with the plumbing. So we had to use the Raiders locker room. So I thought, as a funny thing, I'd go in and use Art Tom's locker because he's a defensive tackle that played with me at Syracuse, and now we were going to face each other. And I was going to leave him a note that I used his stuff and, just messing with him. So I went into it, found his locker, and pulled some shoulder pads out of the way, to put mine in there. And when I did, his game report fell down. He's defensive lineman said, well, I shouldn't say that. Some players don't take real advantage of their game plan, don't keep it with them, and don't keep it under lock and key like Shula likes. And he had just stuffed it under his shoulder pads after his last meeting or practice. And when I put the shoulder pads down, there's the report. Now, fellas, all three of you played some sports. I mean, you played some high school football. You played
Yes.
football before.
Yes.
Yes.
You know what a game plan represents. In other words, what I'm driving at.
Yes.
And the folks that listen to this show, they'll know what I'm talking about if they understand what a game plan. When we line up in this formation, our tendencies are reflected in the numbers of how many times we've lined up in that formation in all the games we played for the last year to date. That suggests that you have an edge by knowing that. Now, if you know what that defense is going to do when you come out in order to stop you and what the highest probability is that they're going to do, but it's outlined right there. This is what they're going to do when we get in this formation the first time. If you know that for sure, you can line up, fake that, and go for the bomb because you'll have one-on-one coverage out of that scenario. You follow me?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, I found that game plan in those shoulder pads. So in other words, if I go to Shula and hand it to him, and he takes our defensive and offensive captain, this is the day before the game. This is over 36 hours before the game. That's when I realized Shula was for real. And I put that in the book. Because I walked over and called, our offensive line coach, Monty Clark, walked up and said, Zonk, what do you got? And I said, I never saw this, and handed it to him. We lost the game. Cut this story. I'll try to make it short. Sorry, guys. I get talking on this stuff. I talk forever.
I love
Sorry.
it. I love it.
But it's a good story. I think it is a good story. You got to tell it all. And so I handed that to Monty Clark, who snapped it, didn't say anything to me, turned around and walked off. We lose the game. Game's very close. We lose it. First game we lost in what? A year. After the game, I come up to Monty Clark. I said, what happened? Why didn't we, we could have had some plays we could have called off of that. That's their ignorance to leave that out. He said, Coach Shula said, tear it up, throw it away. If we can't beat them straight up, then we shouldn't. Guess what? We didn't. There. Now, is that the price of integrity? Yes, it is. But do you have it or do you not have it?
Right.
He goes by, as far as I'm concerned, if you drive into a crowded alley, with a lot of people in it, get out and leave your car running with the door open, what do you think's going to happen? You shouldn't have the integrity to do it just because it's laying there. That sounds good, but I'm just of a different persuasion. When that's handed to you, you take advantage of it. It's where I came from. Shula had a different outlook on that. Can't win it straight up. As far as that was concerned, he was cheating. It's a fine line there, but you got to go with you got to admire him for doing that. And it cost us the game, and I've never let him forget it.
What was your relationship like with Shula? Because from what I understand, he helped you actually in the way you ran. Like when you first came into the NFL, you had a different style of that, and you eventually adapted to.
Yes, to a degree, I led with my head, which wasn't a good idea. And he got me a couple of all-pro Hall of Fame guards and center, and I didn't have to lead with my head. I was leading with my head on defensive backs, not on defensive linemen. You line up and hit a guy like Bob Lilly or Joe Green with your head, you'll find out in a hurry that it's a bit different to hit Krause or Kosalki from Minnesota, defensive backs, with your head. And I paid the price for that. I think Shula mentioned to me about, being more not ducking my head so much, which was a coaching technique that I adhered to, that I tried to adhere to. But with the quality of the improvement of the offensive line under Monty Clark, our offensive line coach, who was an old Cleveland Brown guy that blocked for Jimmy Brown. Now, you talk about a guy that could write a book on how to block and attack a defensive line. This was the guy. He put together that offensive line in front of me. Monty Clark from Cleveland was our offensive line coach. He brought in Kutkenberg and Langer and capitalized on Larry Little's attributes. And we put together a timing thing that was that's when my ball carrying and my health got a lot better, when I had two Hall of Famers and a would-be Hall of Famer line up in front of me.
Larry, I want to take a little left turn here because I loved your book. Like Scott said, it was fantastic. But you had a situation in the Bering Sea that At first, I thought there's no way this is true. Tell us about that story. It's unbelievable.
We had, my wife Audrey and I had been doing the show for a number of years up there in Alaska. I dreamt about doing that, and Kurt Gowdy and some others got me lined up to where we could actually do it. We did the show north to Alaska, out in Alaska for 16 or 17 years. And towards the end of that run, we had an opportunity to go out into the Bering Sea and a far place and do some hunting, but we had a special boat lined up to take us the last 30 miles that we had to traverse in the open ocean to get to where we'd have the excellent hunting. We stayed a little too long, a little too late. We had storm warnings that it was approaching. Make a long story short, we stayed a little too long, got out, couldn't get across back into the protection of the coastline, and we ended up lost all night in the Bering Sea in some 17 and 18-foot waves in about a 28-foot boat. So I'll spare you the gory details. You can read about them in the book, but it came very close to being the end of the story right there.
Yeah. Yeah, you had a few of those in the book. Another one was, in some ways football could have saved your life, Larry, because a lot of you guys your age at that time in our country's history were heading off to Vietnam. And you went to Syracuse and two-time All-American there, but at some point you did go to Vietnam with Bob Hope and the USO. And once again, kind of a near-death experience. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think everyone, particularly in our military, or whether you're in the USO or any kind of supporting services for our military, that went to the mainland in Vietnam or got in close in the ocean to the place, risk your life in some degree. Granted, some much safer than others, but anyone there, the way that war was fought, anywhere you were at was not necessarily safe. And we went with the USO and we flew around to some of the fire bases, the more remote fire bases, and we got stuck. They were flying us in some of the medevac helicopters in order to get us in there to the remote places, the fire bases. And while we were at one fire base that had been attacked us 3 days before, there was a call for the medevacs to pick up some people that were injured, wounded. So we lost our helicopters, and we were there for, probably a day and a half or 2 days at that fire base. And then they found some small light planes that could land nearby on a small strip. And the service sent them out to pick us up. And we got into them and flew back down by Da Nang somewhere. And we're approaching in this little airport. We were just coming in. And here, two snipers had got up in the trees at the end of the airport, and they would try to shoot the fuel tanks in the wings of the incoming military aircraft for the United States. And I happened to be looking out I was sitting up next to the pilot and was looking out of the other seat, and I saw a little piece of the wing fly up, and went to tell him about it. And about that time, he banked the plane, did it nosedive. Make a long story short, we came in and landed, and he came and got me after we got off the plane. And of course, he called in on the radio as soon as he rolled the plane and did that. He called in on the radio, and a Cobra gunship came out and took care of the problem. But we still got in and landed. And then he came and got me and took a flashlight and said, "Crawl under here with me. I want to show you something." And when he did, I got under there and looked up, and that bullet hole from that sniper had gone up and missed the fuel tank by about probably an inch, maybe an inch and a half. If it hits the fuel tank, we blow up in a ball of fire. But wow. It missed by about an inch and a half. So, like I said, anyone that was there for our service or working with our service in Vietnam was in jeopardy from the moment you stepped off on the land, or even when you got close to stepping off on the land. It could happen anywhere at any time. That was a really horrific situation. And I was very appreciative of the guys that were doing that, going through that for us. And we wanted to go with the USO and see them and sign things and take them hats and make them aware of the fact that we still thought about them back here in the U.S.
So football wasn't the most dangerous thing you did. You've had a lot of close encounters.
Yeah.
Yeah, I managed to get myself in a cross. My wife, you'll read that in the book. I talked about my wife warning me about going, and of course, I'm going with Bob Hope on a USO tour. How dangerous can that be? Well, you don't know the circumstance. The real circumstances in Vietnam,
Yeah.
combat was anywhere, anytime. And that was the bottom line.
Needs to be
Horrific situation that is, but that's true.
Yeah.
Needs to be a movie.
I mean, you took chances and stuff. And one thing you did, you had a little bit of the acting bug.
I was friends with Burt Reynolds and the $6 Million Man, several people. They were always after me, kind of kiddingly, to get into that because I like to tell stories and I enjoy reiterating stories. And it's kind of fun to have a laugh about things. And so I tried it a little bit, but I really just yearned to go to the outback. I love places. I say that in a book about Alaska and thinking about doing another book about Alaska because the 15 to 18 years that we spent there doing the show was just, it's every bit as important to me as my NFL career. I'll be honest with you. That's how I just longed to be there. I felt the need to be there, and I got there, and we went and saw. We didn't just go there and live, in one spot. We went out all over the state, from all the way to the north, all the way to the south, to the east and the west, and really got to see it in its entirety, and really enjoyed it. I think that would make a very good book, just to talk about all those places. The reason I wanted to see them, and then what they represented to me as I stood there and actually got to see them.
If there was one place in Alaska you could go back to, just one, they said this is the only place you can go to, where would it be?
Nome.
No.
I always liked Nome. I just think from all the history and then getting there and seeing it, and I'll tell you something. I can't say because I'm not a seasoned veteran. Wasn't born in Nome. I didn't spend a decade there or anything. But I think if there's one place that represents what you hear and read about it from the old time till now, for the last 200 years, certainly it's changed. I wouldn't insult anyone's intelligence. It's changed like we have all changed. But there's more still there the same in the outback in Alaska, particularly around Nome, than there is in anywhere else, in my opinion, from the little traveling around that I did in the state. I really liked it out there. Not to say that the outback, the extreme outback, it doesn't have a warm spot in my heart as does Nome. But I think seeing Nome and knowing all the history of all the people that were there, all the different countries that were there that occupied it, all the things that those folks have gone through that settled that, it's still got heavy characteristics that date back to its beginnings. And it's fun to go there and visit that.
You're right. That does sound like another book. Larry, in this book, you dedicate the book to your parents and to Mr. Saltis. And I just want to, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and I just want to ask, you never know when someone, you were thrown together with him for messing up or screwing around. I can't remember exactly, but this man had such an impact on your life. And so much now we have kids who are playing video games or they're not out. They don't even have the opportunity for someone to have an impact on their life. How important was he in setting you on the right course?
That's very important. What you just mentioned there is the hookup with the modern conveniences. A cell phone connects you to everything, and it's almost like you don't have any of that person-to-person relationship early in your life that you should have, that every kid should have. With me and the fellow that you're talking about was Mr. Saltis, Lawrence Saltis. He was my 8th grade science teacher. He was a World War II veteran. He was a guy of high discipline and had a lot of coaching in his background, had gone through the Second World War and pretty much seen it all by the time he saw me. And he recognized something in me and realized both athletically and both criminally that I had a tendency to perhaps become a good athlete and also had a tendency to perhaps become a convict. say that with a little bit of humor because in seventh grade we all have all have a little touch of convict in us, and that's about the time you learn whether you're going to do that or not. But he recognized he needed to get one beat out of me and get the other installed in me, and he took an interest, and I think that's the biggest compliment I can give him, is unsolicited, just by perchance. He took an interest in me as well as a couple hundred of my other classmates. I've met several people in grades that were older than I at Stowe High School or junior high school, and people that were younger. They all have comparable stories after they read the book. I've met other people on the street that have come up to me and said, you know, your Mr. Saldus was much like my seventh grade principal. And they start to reiterate the story about their principal. He made a difference in my life because he saw something that I had that I didn't even know I had. And he concentrated on me and tried to keep me in between the out of bounds markers a little more than normal. He took an interest and he invested a little bit of time in me at his expense. I owe him greatly. He was at the Hall of Fame. I had him stand up.
Yeah, I mean, you could have dedicated the book to a lot of people. So for him to make that what an honor that you bestowed upon him. I want to talk to you real quickly here. Does anyone ever compare you and Jim Kick and Paul Warfield to Curt Flood? Because in a way, when you guys left Miami for the World Football League, you opened up the possibilities for NFL players to finally make, you know, a really nice living. And of course, Curt Flood did that, and it cost him his career. It didn't cost you your career, but do you know what I'm saying? That by you guys leaving, I mean, and you didn't leave, you know, anyone. You left the Miami Dolphins, you know, the team of the decade, to go play for, as it turned out, Memphis. Do you realize the kind of impact that you had on the future of the game in terms of helping the players?
Well, I think the three of us were at a juncture of time and space where it all came together in that scenario, and a union that had made itself strong enough that you could execute something like that and be able to do it. The league rules had changed drastically in the last few years, and then competition coming in from the outside. It was a critical time, but it still took. It was not, let's put it this way, it was not an easy decision to make to leave the Dolphins. But at the same time, when you have a chance to, you're a professional, that means you're being paid to do what you do, and you find an opportunity to make by a multiple of 10 or 15 your income, it's hard to pass that up. So I won't insult anyone's intelligence by telling them, you know, it just broke my heart to leave the Dolphins. I made a lot of money. That's why I left. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I often wonder if myself and Paul Warfield and Jim Kick would have stayed, if there wouldn't have been the other league come along, what would have happened in those next 3 or 4 years instead of me leaving for 3 or 4 and then coming back for one. What would have happened if particularly the three of us would have stayed? Certainly that's worth of some thought, but at the same time, reality is reality, and I made a large difference in the second part of my life. I got to go to Alaska because of what happened in the NFL and what you just alluded to that happened in the NFL. The reason I got to go up there to Alaska was because of that. I was financially independent and could make that move. Had that not happened, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So one door closes, another opens.
Now, Larry, I don't think anybody can argue you were one of the greatest fullbacks to ever play in the NFL. I know the rules have changed and football has progressed. How disappointed are you that the fullback position in most teams has faded away?
Well, we touched on it a little bit before. The game changes as time goes on. There's more and more people in the stands. It's a more intense thing. It's moment to moment. There's more communication. The rules have changed. So the old style has to give way to the new style. So that's just the way it is. And the new style, you know, there's a tendency if you played under the old style to criticize the new style. Well, if it's enthusiasm and it generates even more enthusiasm and the fans enjoy it, yeah, from a player's point of view, I'd like to have seen the power running game, which was executed with 3 or 4 interior linemen being predominant in whether it existed or not. It was if you had that communication and that ability with those 4 players or 5 players to become dominant on a short running game, which changed the entire complexion of the rest of the game. But that's a very hard thing to understand the intricacies of. We touched on that before. Mm-hmm. But it's easy to understand that pass, and the pass creates the excitement. It even generates more excitement than a 4-yard run does. Ball control, not as much fan appreciation. Perhaps in the long run, yes, but in the short play-to-play, you can leave and go get the popcorn and come back and not miss much. Today, you leave and go get the popcorn, you miss a lot. By the time you come back, it can be 14 points the other direction.
Mm-hmm. I love the run. I'm sorry. Maybe it's just me. I love the running game. Great passing was great, but I love seeing guys go between the tackles, run over a guy, and keep going. I think everyone can remember the Earl Campbell when he runs into Isaiah Robertson.
There you go. There you
go. That's what you want. But
me too.
You too. Exactly. Exactly.
That's what I meant. With Bronco Nagurski.
Exactly.
Still the biggest time of my life.
Yeah.
I idolized him when I was a kid, reading about him. I didn't get to see him play, but I idolized him. And I read about the things he did and how he did them. And I mimicked that. And then I think, well, maybe somebody will do that. But see, the games, it's changed from his time to my time. It changed. But then it changed even more drastically at an accelerated rate from my time to this time. So you can't argue with that. It's a good thing. People are still enthusiastic about it. They still enjoy it. It's still a good game.
We do a little segment called 50-50, and it's basically a 50-50 chance to get a trivia question right. And because of your love of Alaska, we're going to do an Alaska trivia question with you, okay? So this one you probably know. It's probably a slam dunk. True or false? Is Alaska the largest state in the Union in terms of size?
I believe it is.
You are correct. 663,268 square miles. It is more than twice the size of Texas, which is in second.
I thought it was 2.5 times the size of Texas, but the information I got from that was from an Alaskan, so he might be a little biased. Alaskans are very proud of that fact,
and you've seen every.
They liked it when they came into the Union, and they said something like 17 times the size of the state of Rhode Island or something. They had all the different states all lined up how it fit in there. And, I don't know how Hawaii was accepted becoming one of the states, but I know the Alaskans because I was up there shortly after that. And a lot of them remember that, and, when they were kids or in high school and stuff, and they're now grown-ups. And that is a very proud moment for them because they really felt like that designated them as being one of us finally instead of a possession. And I think there was a lot of pride that went in that. I'm sure the sentiment's the same in Hawaii, particularly after what they went through in the Second World War. But Alaska, there's a tremendous amount of pride by the elders, the older folks up there, that they had decided and petitioned and became elected to the Union. It was a great thing.
I have a soft spot for Alaska because I was born the year it came into the Union in 1959. So soft spot for Alaska, and I totally enjoyed Juneau and Ketchikan and Skagway.
It's beautiful.
It's a beautiful state.
Yeah, it's nice if you go up there and travel around where you can say those names and you picture them as you're saying them. You can picture the places. It's I hope all Americans that have any interest in the outback or critters or the wild or history, any one of those 3 or 4 different flavors, have an opportunity to go and not just visit one spot, but perhaps see 2 or 3 different locations in Alaska. I think it would really be an education for them.
Larry, I'm going to close with this. We're starting this podcast, and it's called Past Our Prime because the 3 of us we're not quite ready to call it quits, but others have been calling it quits for us. And I go to your book, and you finish your book when Jim and Merck came to join you up in Alaska. What a special time that must have been. You know, the relationships you had with those guys, that incredible backfield. And you write, in retrospect, as glorious and improbable as our victories had been, and as gut-wrenching and devastating as our losses and disappointments were on the field and in life, this brief time spent in Alaska together, 40 years past our prime, felt just about perfect. And that's exactly how this interview was. Just about perfect on Past Our Prime. Larry, can't thank you enough. Your storytelling is off the charts, and I hope we get to do it again sometime.
Take care.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, gentlemen.
You're the
Thank
best.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So there you have it, the MVP of the Super Bowl VIII, Csonka. And I'm telling you, man, his football stories are great, but his stories of his life after that are just unbelievable. The reads like a fictional account, and it's a memoir in his book. Mm-hmm. But want to go back to that game in particular, which was played in Houston, Texas, and joining us now, a dear friend of mine, Joe Fowler, who at the time was a teenager, I believe, Joe. And
yes, and still am.
And still am. Has not matured at all.
No.
But Joe,
I've gone backwards.
You've been to a few of those big games known as the Super Bowl, but that was the first one.
Yes, that was the first one. I was living in San Antonio, Texas, 176 miles from Houston, and it's the closest the Super Bowl was ever going to be to me. And I had my little red Datsun, so a buddy and I were going to go to the Super Bowl in January of '74. Well, my buddy bailed at the last second. And I am lucky that he did, because I still went. I drove to Houston. Super Bowl was a big event by then. I think the Jets and the Colts put it really on the map a few years earlier. I get out. I start wandering around. I have no idea. I mean, I don't have a ticket, obviously. And I'm wandering around looking at everything and just in awe of the spectacle. Now, you're going to say this isn't true. But what I'm going to tell you is 100% true. A guy walks up to me. That's believable. And he says, "Do you want to get into the Super Bowl?" Yeah, older guy. And he said, "Well, my nephew couldn't come with me. Would you like to come to the Super Bowl inside with me?"
Wow.
Today, red flag would go up. Like, what? Yeah. But I couldn't say yes fast. Like, yes, sir. Yes, sir. He leads me in to Rice Stadium, first level, east side. It's the Viking side. 47-yard line, 22 rows up. You can see everything. Wow. I'm in prime territory. He takes it. We sit down. I don't know. What is this, a dream? And we're there like 20 minutes before kickoff, and we proceed to watch the Super Bowl. I'm watching it with a stranger. And
yeah, but he knew you.
He knew me. 17-year-old me. How does he know me?
How did he know you?
Well, baseball. I grew up an Atlanta Braves fan. We lived in Atlanta for 1 year, 5th grade. Saw Hank Aaron hit a home run to win a game. I'm sold. I love the Braves. In San Antonio, I would drive to Houston. The Braves and the Astros were in the same division then, the West. Mm-hmm. How Atlanta's in the West, but they were. So they'd come to Houston several times a year. I would drive to root for my Braves. And I would get a ticket on the Braves' third base side and cheer for the Braves in the cavernous Astrodome with all the Astros fans. So when the Astros weren't cheering, that meant I was, because something good was happening with the Braves. All right. So just note that I'm a big Braves fan, and I would go to the Astrodome. So now let's go back to the Super Bowl. I finally, after a quarter or so, I turn to the guy, and, I'm in awe that I'm even there. And I say, "Sir, why me? Why did you give me this ticket? And he said, well, I know you. So what? I am the assistant to the president and the traveling secretary of the Atlanta Braves. Wow. And I said, well, that's my favorite team. He said, oh, I know. I travel with them. When I'm in Houston, we all see you down on the third baseline, fearing and yelling and making a fool out of yourself. And he said, I recognize you. I saw you from a distance here today. And I said, that's the kid who's a Braves fan at the Astrodome when I come into town.
Unbelievable.
That's why he chose me. And by the way, Donald Davidson is his name. He is infamous in baseball, passed away many years ago, but he worked for the Braves. He knew Babe Ruth. He worked for the Braves. He ended up his career in Houston with the Astros and was revered by the Astros, and a great man. And obviously for me, a hero, because he got me into my first Super Bowl, which really inspired me. I mean, I kept in touch with him for years after that.
Thank God his nephew got sick.
Man.
I know.
And thank God your
buddy doesn't
go.
get sick, we go there together, and I'm never approached by Donald Davidson.
Right.
Never approached by him. And then I don't go to that Super Bowl necessarily. We don't know. And that doesn't lead to 22 more Super Bowls, never paying for any of them other than scalping or sneaking in. And it was all Donald Davidson. And, you know, I didn't really know the importance of Donald Davidson until I started looking him up and learning about him. What a prince of a human being. He had a disease when he was 5 years old, stopped growing. He was 4'6". Oh, wow. He had a limp. He was a giant in the business of baseball. And folks, look him up, Donald Davidson. He's special to many, many people and extremely special to me because, let me show you this. This is what he handed me 50 years ago. There's the Super Bowl ticket. That's 22 rows up. Look at the price, guys.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what was the price?
Look.
What is that, 15?
$15.
Oh, my gosh.
And what are Super Bowl tickets going nowadays?
I think they're face value around $5,000 now.
Oh,
I think.
my gosh.
I could be wrong.
But the other thing that was really interesting, playing at Rice-Eccles Stadium, could you imagine a Super Bowl today being played at a tiny, outdated stadium like that?
Well, it's tiny and outdated now, but that Super Bowl was supposed to be at the Astrodome, and it was too small. You could only fit 50,000. Rice was bigger. Rice had 70,000 people at it. That was huge for the time. But yeah, today, no. But that was the first Super Bowl played in a non-NFL stadium. All the other, the others were in NFL stadiums, and they chose that because it was bigger than the Astrodome.
And the Super Bowls then weren't played in prime time. They were played like, a normal Sunday,
Well,
NFL
let's see
game.
how the kickoff was. Yeah, 2:30.
Yeah, which would be like 12:30 on the West Coast.
Right, that's the pregame show now. Here's the 47-yard line, guys. This was my seat.
Wow.
Taken from my seat.
Oh, my God.
Nice.
And I think Minnesota has the ball. Tarkenton is...
He's running for his life.
As he could do. But that led to that Super Bowl, and then, my gosh, I was hooked. I started going to almost any Super Bowl I could possibly go to, and I've had some really great times at them, too.
Now, what do you remember about that game other than getting in?
Yeah, and you know what? Almost that's about it. I was in so much awe of the fact that I was sitting at the Super Bowl. I couldn't run to a payphone and call collect quick enough to tell my parents where I was. I remember that Zonka was a beast. I remember that Miami took a quick lead and never looked back. I don't think the game was a great game, but it did not matter. I remember I tried to buy Donald Davidson a hot dog. He said, no, let me get you one. This guy was, that just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. I was blessed that day to be at that game. It was a bad day weather-wise. It was like 40 some odd degrees in Houston and overcast. Didn't matter to me. I was in heaven. I was in heaven.
If you weren't a Braves fan, then you never get into the game. It's only because you were a Braves fan.
Only because I had the gall to drive my car after high school, after the school, to the Astrodome, go to a game for the Braves game, cheer for the Braves, drive back home, do homework, go again the next day. Or if it was a weekend series, I'd go on a Friday, stay at the Roadrunner Inn across from the Astrodome, and stay for all the games that weekend. I hardly ever missed a Braves game in Houston. And what it was, look, I could have gone to that Braves game and sat on my hands and said, nice game. Go Braves, go Braves. I had a pennant, Braves hat. I yelled, I cheered. I was possibly obnoxious.
It's hard to imagine.
No.
What's that?
It's hard to imagine.
No.
Oh, you stop it. But you're right. I even ran out on the field and argued with the umpires at the end of the game.
Did you?
And they still let you back.
Oh, and they let me back. No, there was no, yeah. So imagine Donald Davidson was up in the press box laughing at this. And he said, I was great entertainment for all the press up there. They actually would note what I was doing down there. So now I don't know how he put 2 and 2 together. You're at a Super Bowl and you're seeing all these people and he noticed me. I don't recall I was wearing a Braves paraphernalia, but I might have been. But he caught me and that changed everything because the Super Bowl became a big deal to me to go to almost as many times as I could.
Did they have a nickname for you? Did they look down and call you, oh, that's the crazy fan? Or because they didn't know you was Joe, did they have a nickname?
They had to have just noted me as that embarrassing kid down there. The Astros fan, look, I had more Astros fans looking up at me, telling me to shut up, sit down. You gotta understand, 50,000 seat Astrodome, 10,000 people in there, and one Braves fan, and I was loud. And I loved every minute of it. I used to, after the games, go down in the exit and talk to the Braves fans, as the Braves players as they were getting on the bus. You know, this is what I love about this podcast you guys are doing. You guys are bringing back that wonderful age of sports. This is my youth. You know, this is the great moments that really shaped me and formed me. And the fact that you're like ripping off a page of a Sports Illustrated and bringing it to life and having Larry Zonka on and having people who have experienced it on, you're filling a void. And I love this. I mean, this is terrific idea on your part. Congrats, because that was a moment that I'll never forget. And the fact that I was there and could have experienced it and every little thing that had to happen to get me in there is amazing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll be sending a check in the mail for that there, Joe. I very much appreciated. Billy?
You are filling the void.
Yeah.
Joe, I have to go back. You seriously went on the field and argued with the umpire after the game?
Yep.
How did that come about? What did they say to you?
It was the final play of the game, and it was a play in which the Braves had a runner on second. It could have been Ralph Garr, who's very fast, and a base hit. He rounded third. And they called him out at home plate. Now, I always had a seat behind third base dugout. That's where I got my seat.
Well, he was clearly safe.
Yeah, obviously.
Oh, you all saw that.
Yes.
So imagine this. Umpire, you're out. Game over, because the Astros had a 1-run lead. Astros are already walking off. I jump over the fence, race over to the umpire, and it's me, and I think Eddie Matthews was the manager at the time of the Braves. We're both arguing with the umpire. It's like, and we're both yelling at him. You didn't get it right. You're completely wrong. And, you know, I'm realizing as I'm down there, I'm saying, wait a minute. I'm not going to really affect this very much, and I really shouldn't be down here. So I wasn't down there more than about 30 seconds, but I yelled at him.
That's great.
And turned around and went back up. The game was over, so people were leaving. If this was the middle of a game, like ended an inning, I'd be in Astros jail.
Right.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
But it was the end of the game, so I felt like, okay, I paid my money. I'm going down there.
Gonna
I'm
go
gonna
get
argue
you.
it.
get your 2 cents.
You realize if you had video of that, you'd be an influencer right now on TikTok. It'd be.
Those days were the days when we couldn't get any of that stuff. Just think about all the antics that we were all involved in the 70s and 80s, and we don't have any video proof of it other than right up here, which is all right by me, because the memories are what it's all about. And, 50 years ago, 45 years, just that whole era is indelible for me.
But in 1974, a big year for you. So you get to go to that first Super Bowl, and then months later, you get to see Hank Aaron break Babe Ruth's record.
And I did. I saw that on TV, the one where he broke his record, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Off
I'm
Al
living
Dowling.
in San Antonio.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he's in Atlanta. However, I was awarded a spot on the President's Council for high schoolers, and I took a bus, and it was in Washington, D.C. So I took a bus to Washington, D.C. It was the end of my school year in April. We went to it was me and another buddy. We went to the deal in Washington, D.C., and the bus, believe it or not, route was straight back to San Antonio. Not for me. I went through Atlanta, and a few days later, I saw not the home run that broke Babe Ruth's record, the next home run, which was against Cincinnati, where there were only about 10,000 people in the stadium. I saw that one in person.
You saw number 716.
716 in prime
seat. Which was a record at the time.
Exactly. Just as good.
Right. He set another record.
Yes.
But so that's how much of a Braves fan I was. It's nuts how listen, I ran away from home after a game against was the Cincinnati Reds, not that year, when the Braves lost and lost big. I said, that's it. I'm leaving, and I ran away from home, and that was the opening day game. I was so beat up about it. I thought we're not gonna have a good team. This is terrible. I hate this.
Yeah.
But
oh boy.
Bottom line is we ended up moving to Colorado. I have a daughter who's a Rockies fan, so now it's tempered. I love the Rockies, which is also very frustrating. Don't get me going on that. But Braves, baseball, Super Bowl VIII, all intertwined and all really hard to believe that it even happened. But I was there, and I'm proud of it. And there were 22 other Super Bowls after that.
Yeah,
some of them really strange.
We'll definitely bring you back to talk about those as well, Joe, because this was fantastic. This is what this is all about, a trip down memory lane. And this story is one for the ages. So thank you very much, my friend. Very much appreciated.
You guys, I'm proud of what you're doing. Keep it up. I can't wait to watch these and see all the action as you bring these players and teams and coaches back to us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah. So there you have Joe Fowler, one of my dear friends. I worked with Joe at KCal. Bill, I think you crossed paths with him right as you started at KCal. He wasn't there a long time. And then I've been in a fantasy baseball league with Joe for, this will be our 30th year coming up. And he takes that kind of enthusiasm in every aspect of his life. It's infectious and annoying, all wrapped into one. But no, he's got some other great stories about Super Bowls that he and his buddy Andy Pollin attended via scalping, and we'll talk to him about those at some other time. But next up on the docket, when I think of the Chicago Bulls as a great basketball team, I mean, we're talking about Michael and Scotty and that era of basketball. But they were pretty good this time 50 years ago when they just so happened to be in the same division as the Milwaukee Bucks. And the Milwaukee Bucks had a guy by the name of Lou Alcindor. But the Bulls had the third best record at this point that year, 31-17 behind Bob Love and Chet Walker, but they also had Jerry Sloan, Norm Van Leer, so a
Tom
very
Bullwinkle.
good team. Yeah. They would, but they played the Bucks, I believe, in the playoffs, and
I think they lost to the Bucks. I think they got swept by the Bucks in the Eastern Finals.
Yeah.
But and they finished second to the Bucks during the regular season. But it's funny, the Bulls were playing second fiddle to the Bucks, and then 10 years later, Michael Jordan comes in the league, and the Bulls, when they started to get good, had to play second fiddle to the Pistons for a while till they finally got over that hump, and then they became the dominant franchise that they were.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that brings us to what would end up being maybe the story of the year, which was, and we'll talk about this more in detail in a couple weeks, but the rematch between Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali. It was coming up in about another week at Madison Square Garden. And, you know, one thing about Muhammad Ali that is just so reminiscent of wrestling was that he loved to sell, and he sold it by being the heel. And he went after Smokin' Joe just viciously, to the point to where many thought crossed a line, and Joe did not take too kindly to it.
Yeah.
I remember the first fight, actually, in 71, which was going to be like the fight of the century. And I was in 6th grade, and everybody in school, even kids that didn't care about sports, were talking about it. It was like the big thing. And I don't know, for some reason I was rooting for Frazier to win that fight. I don't know why. But he ended up winning that fight, and that was only one of the 3 fights that he did win. But it's funny that the first fight was the most hyped, but the third fight is probably the best of the bunch.
I think the best part about the second fight was 5 days prior to the fight, they get on Wide World of Sports, and they're having Ali and Frazier are sitting next to each other, little double box, and they're watching that first fight. Well, Muhammad Ali gets tired of Joe Frazier saying stuff, so he calls him ignorant. And then Joe Frazier says, "What are you calling me ignorant for?" So they get in a fight on Wide World of Sports, and Howard Cosell's going, "I don't know if this is acting or this is a carnival." It wasn't. He disliked him so much at that time that they got into a wrestling match on the set. It's unbelievable, because the second fight didn't really match up to the other fights, but that fight prior did.
Yeah. And, you know, like I said, Ali was a great salesman.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he was trying to get people interested in the fight. They would have been interested anyway, because they were 2 of the greatest heavyweights, not only of that era, but of all time. But Muhammad was a showman, maybe first and foremost, and he was a great boxer as well. But Frazier lost the heavyweight title to Foreman in Jamaica, and he beat some guy named Joe Bugner or something like that. Bugner.
Yep.
People thought, I think he's 32, 33 years old maybe, and so they thought, but that both these guys were past their prime. They weren't quite, and they put on a good, like you said, they had 2 more fights, and it really was the golden age of boxing in terms of the heavyweights.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I just was doing some little notes that Frazier, when he came in, he was undefeated when he came in to face Ali. But after that, he went 6-4 the rest of his career. So that first fight with Ali took a lot out of Frazier. Mind you, he fought a lot of tough guys. Remember that heavyweight division back in those days was Ken Norton, Ron Lyle, Ernie Shavers. It wasn't just, cupcake. It was, guys that could hit.
Yeah, even the Jerry Quarries and stuff, were to be reckoned with.
And it was interesting is that Frazier, lost his title to Foreman, and I think Ali learned a valuable lesson watching that fight, realizing that you can't go toe-to-toe with Foreman early on. You've got to sort of wait him out and see what kind of stamina he has, which is, what eventually helped him to beat Foreman years later.
And if you look back, just looking at some of the videos, that rope-a-dope was absolutely amazing. Muhammad Ali would just sort of sit against it. You'd think he's done. And the guy'd be hitting him. Then he'd just come out, boom, boom, boom. He was just absolutely ahead of his time, a genius in the ring.
Yeah.
And obviously out of the ring.
Yeah, yeah. Then we'll...
One last comment I want to make. Who would have thought that George Foreman would become the next Muhammad Ali in the sense of showmanship and selling stuff?
Yeah.
Because he was a very serious fighter.
He never talked.
Then. Yeah, and he didn't and then after his boxing career, or even when he revived it, he became this figure, this that went beyond sports, this fun-loving guy, this salesman. He was kind of like the next Muhammad Ali in that sense.
Yeah. No question. No question. And I still have one of his grills.
I did too. I just got rid of it recently. Yeah, and I mean, but that's George Foreman. We always know the great call against Frazier. Down goes Frazier, down. I mean, George Foreman, and we also remember the fight. It's not saying this is about Foreman when he knocked out Michael Moore. So he kept even going back into the '90s to come back.
Yep.
So
Big comeback.
Foreman turned out to be the biggest one of them all. Surprisingly,
in some ways. Yeah. On to college basketball, and the story then, was always and had been for about 10 years was UCLA, and they were right at the tail end of their huge winning streak. It got to 87 games, but with that 87th win, Bill Walton hurt his back, and so there was questions as to whether or not he was going to make the trip to play at Notre Dame the coming weekend. So kind of an interesting take on that.
They were 12-0, and Long Beach State was 12-1. And the funny thing about that was Long Beach State had recently lost their coach, a guy by the name of Jerry Tarkanian, who had just become the new coach at UNLV. And so UNLV was actually didn't get off to a great start of that week of the issue. They had a bad week. And then Tarkanian's former team, Long Beach State, got put on 3 years probation. So it was kind of an interesting...
Yeah. And the Long Beach State administration, if I have this correctly, they wanted the NCAA to adopt a rule where the school didn't get necessarily put on probation, but that the people who made the infractions got it, so that Tarkanian would be on probation where he went and Long Beach State would not. It's an interesting concept, because you're not really punishing the people who brought this on the school.
Actually, a fair rule, wouldn't it be?
You would think so.
Get rid of the guys that are doing the trouble. Why punish kids that are coming in, sort of like what NCAA did to USC? Punish the people, not the school.
Yeah. When he was still at Long Beach State, the Niners almost beat Wooden and UCLA. It was a very, very tight game, and they came within a whisker of pulling up a major upset.
Here's a weird one: Minnesota and Michigan playing, and Michigan's up 7 with 37 seconds to play. They get it down to 2, and they tip in a shot with just seconds remaining, sending the home crowd into a frenzy. Right, tie game. But there was this is so 50 years ago, there was a burned out light bulb in the scoreboard. So they weren't down 2 when they tipped it in. They were down 3. And so they were still down 1. They end up losing the game. Is that crazy? The crowd goes crazy because they're looking at the scoreboard. The scoreboard's wrong, and they lose by 1. So, that wouldn't happen today.
That's what I was going to say. Nowadays, there's no way.
Right.
I mean, there'd be a riot.
Yeah,
no
question.
In those days, everyone at home and went, well, maybe they'll fix the scoreboard next time.
Hope you guys had fun. Free ice cream with your ticket.
Kentucky Fried Chicken for everybody.
And then, of course, the names that you just see. North Carolina State plays Maryland. Maryland gets 24 from Tom McMillan, who would go on to become a U.S. House of Representative. But David Thompson pours in 41 for the Wolfpack.
And they would win the title that year.
Yeah.
But did you see the other stat? On defense, he held his man to 2 points. So David Thompson was good on both ends of the court.
Wow. Yeah.
He had a really good NBA career. I think he was with the Nuggets. And one year, he and George Gervin were fighting for the NBA scoring title. And I think they both scored like 70 points, like on the final day of the season, as they were battling for that scoring title.
And now it's you look at David Thompson. I think it only took North Carolina State 50 years, it appears. They put a statue out at NC State of David Thompson recently.
Really?
Yeah. It should have been shorter time than that.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't get me into that UCLA North Carolina State game. We'll talk it on in future shows. But
you haven't gotten over it yet?
I still don't get over what they should have won the title.
I see your fist clenching.
Of course, they should have lost the title in '75, so I guess everything evens out.
Maybe. Lastly, for the most part, Bobby Fischer has a place in our pop culture for basically the fact that we don't know almost anything about him. But I mean, even the headline of this is a mystery wrapped in an enigma, and it's a fascinating story. I really didn't think I was going to get through all of it because it's about chess, but it was about all the games and the gamesmanships that he was going through, having to play the Russians to become the Grandmaster champion, and pretty fascinating stuff.
I think it just, to me, reading it, all I wrote was, weird dude. He always showed up late. He wanted everything changed. He wanted the rules changed. He didn't like, he once asked for the place where they were playing to take 7 rows of seats out.
Yep.
He wanted to play in like a ping pong room. And you wonder if he obviously beats Boris Spassky, but you look back on it and think, dude, just play the game of chess. But he never stopped.
I remember the match with Spassky. It was the summer of '72. I was actually in Europe with my family on a trip, but all the headlines, everything was about this chess match. You could actually watch as they were making moves. They'd have a big chessboard up there, and you'd see who was making a move where, and then it was non-stop talk about that, which is so funny because who would ever think chess as being this today? If you talk to any kid or whatever and said, "Oh man, this chess match was just unbelievable" and stuff like that.
Yeah, they'd rightly roll their eyes at
Right.
you.
I mean, the Queen's Gambit kind of gave chess a little bit more, stature recently, but back in '72, that was a big.
Well, you're talking,
event.
the crust of the Cold War,
Right.
and the two countries did not like nor trust each other when it came to anything, and that much hasn't changed, I guess. But you're right, Bill. I mean, he would show up 30 minutes late.
Yeah.
They didn't know if he would show up.
There was points he'd say, I'm not even going to get on the plane unless you have this for me, unless you have this car for me. It's like, doggone.
Yeah, he was, and to the point to where the Russians demanded an apology, and the U.S. Federation, I think, wrote something, but Bobby wouldn't sign it, and
he's like a Howard Hughes of chess. Sort of,
And he was probably on the spectrum, and back then they didn't, diagnose people with that you were, on the spectrum, and so they just chalked it up to him being weird or stuff like that, and that's not necessarily the case. He's quirky, but everybody sees things differently. There's their mind processes stuff.
He sure knew how to play a rook, so we got that.
He did. And lastly, as we spoke about last week with Dr. J being on the cover of last week's Sports Illustrated, the Nets won 30 games last season, and this week they matched that total of 30 wins already with, I think they would go on to win 54 games and the ABA championship, and Dr. J was the most valuable player. But so that's a look back at the January 21st, 74 issue. Can't say enough good things about Larry Csonka. I can't, like I said, recommend his book, Head On, a memoir. If you like sports biographies, it is so much more than just a football story. He's got all sorts of stories about his acting days and going to Vietnam and all that stuff that we touched on. What a great guy, man. And talk about, he hasn't lost a bit.
No, and if you think you're going to get his book and all it's going to be is we ran a trap left, hook right, it's not. It gets into his life prior to football, after football, and during football. It gives you stories and a look into his life, and you're like, wow.
We didn't even talk about the fact that he's at Syracuse, and they're like, Larry, you need to get home. Your sister's been stabbed.
Yes, and you're going to play defense.
Yeah, he was a linebacker.
Yeah, he had to convince a guy to let him run the ball.
Yeah, I'll just spoiler alert. His sister turned out okay, but read the book. It's well worth it. It's well worth it. So, hey, thanks guys. Enjoy the week, and we'll see everybody next week. Past Our Prime podcast. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
See ya.